Welcome to episode 191 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week we continue our discussion of books 1 and 2 of Cicero's On Ends, which are largely devoted to Epicurean philosophy. On Ends contains important criticisms of Epicurus that have set the tone for the standard analysis of his philosophy for the last 2,000 years. Going through this book gives us the opportunity to review those attacks, take them apart, and respond to them as an ancient Epicurean might have done. Last week we concluded at the end of section 7, and so we're on page 11 of the Reed edition, near the top of the page with Roman numeral number 7. And at this point, we're about to turn the conversation back over to Torquatus. Cicero says here, after I'd said this, Triarius said with a slight smile, "You on your side have, I may say, banished Epicurus entirely from the company of philosophers. What concession have you made to him but that whatever his style, you understand his meaning? In natural science, his deliverances are unoriginal, and in themselves such as you do not accept. Whenever he has tried to make improvements in them, they have turned out to be corruptions. He had no skill in logic. In declaring pleasure to be the supreme good, he betrayed in the first place by that very proceeding narrowness of vision. In the second, he was plagiarist once more, for Aristippus had maintained the same tenets earlier, and better too. You added in conclusion that he was uneducated as well."
Right. So then Cicero picks up the thread then. He says, Triarius, said I, one cannot in any way avoid stating what one does not accept in the system of a philosopher with whom one disagrees. Pray, what would hinder me from becoming an Epicurean if I accepted the doctrines of Epicurus? So the adverse criticisms passed on each other by men who disagree are not to be censured. It is reviling and insult, and again passionate conflicts and obstinate encounters in debate, which always seem to me unworthy of philosophy.
And so then at this point, Torquatus is going to begin his narration, and he says, without adverse criticism, there can be no debate, but if you don't object, I have a reply that I should like to make to what you've said. And Cicero says, of course I want to hear your reply. Do you think that we were doing it for any other reason than that? And Torquatus says, do you prefer that we should run over the whole system of Epicurus or confine the inquiry to the one subject of pleasure on which the whole dispute turns? Now, that's an interesting thing there that Torquatus is saying that the whole dispute turns on pleasure. Cicero has said earlier that Epicurus's chief claim to fame was in his physics, and probably behind all of the dispute is the question of whether there's a supernatural God and directing the universe, creating things and leading people and rewarding people after death and so forth. But Torquatus is suggesting that the central issue is pleasure.
That is interesting. In the Greek anthology, or the Planudian anthology, Epicurus's name comes up in a few epigrams. And in all of those epigrams, his name comes up because of his atomism, which I don't know how accurate or how representative that is really, but it gives me a reason to understand that it was really his atomism that people were engaging with in the ancient world, more so maybe than just his claim that pleasure was the telos, that pleasure was the goal of life.
Cicero is setting this up as if this is Torquatus's idea, to think that pleasure is the only question that needs to be addressed in detail. But before he gets to that, Torquatus is saying that natural science I shall leave to another occasion, when certainly I will demonstrate to you not only that our philosopher's doctrine of the swerve and of the sun's size was correct, but that many blunders of Democritus have been criticized and set right by Epicurus. And as he goes into pleasure, he doesn't really have anything new to say. But I do think it's interesting that Cicero said that the most important topic of Epicurus is natural science.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we talk about all the time, isn't it? That if you're looking for really the most kind of revolutionary idea in Epicurean philosophy, it's not just pleasure seeking, which has become the easier target. It is this understanding that nature exists and proceeds without divine intervention, right? That's the key claim. That's the claim that turns everything else on its head. So it's good to see that point made here. Now, one of the things we talked about in the last episode of the DeWitt series of this podcast was these early Renaissance figures like Lorenzo Valla and Cosimo Raimondi and Farinata degli Uberti and their engagement with Epicurean philosophy. And one of the sources that we read indicated that most of them were writing before the widespread circulation of Diogenes Laertius, before the circulation of Lucretius, the rediscovery and circulation of Lucretius. And so the books they must have been working with at the time primarily is this book by Cicero. So the tone that he sets, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, Cassius, the tone that he sets becomes hugely important for all of the later understanding of Epicurean philosophy until within just the last few centuries.
Yes, we're now up to section 9, it seems, and this is where Torquatus begins his discussion. Torquatus starts out by setting the stage and saying that what we really need to be talking about is what is the climax and standard of things good. And this, in the opinion of all philosophers, must needs be such that we are bound to test all things by it, but the standard itself by nothing. And of course, then says Epicurus places his standard in pleasure, which he lays down to be the supreme good, while pain is the supreme evil. Okay, so Cicero has set up the discussion with his criticisms of Epicurus. Torquatus says, well, I'll come back to natural science and even epistemology later. Let's go straight into the ethics and discuss whether pleasure is the goal, because you've said Aristippus did it better. You've said that this is the system that's most unworthy of the human race. You've said the Torquati didn't look for pleasure. They were looking for virtue and glory in the way they conducted themselves. And you said, Cicero, that Epicureans don't really value mental pleasure because when we read history and poetry and literature, we don't take pleasure in it, and that's not the right definition of pleasure. So all of these things sort of resolve themselves back down into what is the standard according to which we're judging all our actions. Is it pleasure? Is it wisdom? Is it piety to the gods? Is it virtue? Is it something else? And Torquatus is saying Epicurus places this standard in pleasure.
Right. And we can't really avoid saying this, which is the next part. Every creature, as soon as it is born, seeks after pleasure and delights therein as its supreme good, while it recoils from pain as its supreme evil, and banishes that so far as it can from its own presence. And this it does while still uncorrupted, and while nature herself prompts unbiased and unaffected decisions. So this is how we know that it is pleasure that is the telos, or the good, or the end, the proper end of all behavior in human life. These facts, he continues, are simply observed, just as the facts that fire is hot, snow is white, and honey sweet. And he rests his proof not on formal argument, but on observing infants and very young animals, lower orders of animals who don't even have the capacity to actually form an idea of what they're doing. Still, they seek after pleasure and avoid pain.
Yeah, Joshua, it's really interesting to me how the more time you spend reading Epicurus, over time, your understanding and the things that you sort of pick up on will change. And we did the review of Torquatus many months ago at this point. This time, as we go through it, I bet we'll come up with some different perspectives. And one of the things that I think bears emphasis is right after the part that you just read, Torquatus is going to say that this is an issue that is debated within the Epicurean community. Some people agree with Epicurus that simply observing pleasure and pain to be an operation in nature is all you need to do, and that it's not even appropriate to launch into any long, logical, or involved debate in support of it. Torquatus himself says that he doesn't really agree with that position and says that he thinks it is a good idea to get into an elaborate debate about it. One aspect of that strikes me as interesting is when you think about Lucretius's poem and you think about, well, where in Lucretius's poem does he really spend a lot of time arguing in favor of pleasure as the good? At this point, I would say Lucretius has chosen to follow Epicurus's position. He starts out in book 1 of the poem by the relatively long section observing how Venus or nature or pleasure is the motivating guide of human life. People call that the hymn to Venus, but it's basically just a look there, look at how the world operates. Everything is chasing pleasure as its goal. And it could be that what Lucretius has chosen to do and not extending that argument into a full book or going into greater detail is he's just following what Epicurus said here. There's no way to be more convincing about nature's guidance through pleasure and pain than simply to look at nature and observe how things are. And so this little section here seems to me to be particularly enlightening about the way the Epicureans were talking among themselves about how to prove this point. The rest of all of this discussion, where he talks about whether you're pursuing courage or wisdom or friendship or whatever, you're still after pleasure. All of that's just sort of an elaboration of a single theme that once you've decided that pleasure is the goal, then all these other things are just tools to achieve pleasure. But the actual argument that pleasure is or should be the goal is pretty much contained just in this relatively short passage here that says that there's no need for any proof of that other than to observe it. Just like sugar is sweet and snow is white, pleasure is to be desired according to nature and pain is to be avoided.
Yes, Lucretius talks about this extensively in the Hymn to Venus without really giving an argument for it. He's pointing to the way that these animals behave. And as he says, Venus is sola gubernus, the sole governor of these things, where the herds of wild beasts leap in carefree fields, swim through raging rivers, so seized with joy and eagerness. All follow you, no matter where you lead. From there through seas and mountains, roaring streams, the leafy tenements of the birds, and fields now turning green, as you inspire all hearts with tempting love, and through desire bring out new generations, each in accordance with its kind. So it's not just that individual animals pursue pleasure, but the whole operation of procreation and the new generation of the species is actually entirely wrapped up in this goal that is the pursuit of pleasure.
Yes. And one thing I left out of our summary of what Cicero had said last week is that the premise of this discussion right now is that it's appropriate to look to see what nature is actually doing as your proof of what you should do yourself. And that's really the heart of where Cicero objects, because his objection from last week, we talked about it in terms of it being unworthy of the human race. Cicero used the phrase that nature has created and shaped us for higher aims. So the background argument through all of this is that there are somehow higher goals than what we observe nature to be doing in the rest of the animal world.
Yeah, and of course he's coming off a tradition of this old academy tradition of Plato and Aristotle, where the idea is that nature is the accident or event which conceals the real substance of things, that the true nature of things is hidden from our sight, and that we need to, as it were, uncloud our own eyes by using philosophy in order to really see into the heart of things. So this superficial display of the pursuit of pleasure that you see in lower orders of animals conceals the real destiny and ambition of mankind, which is far higher in aim than what the animals are doing. We shouldn't look to them because we have our own destiny as a thinking species.
And that recalls what you discussed more at length last week, Joshua, about Democritus and his positions that ends up being much more in the direction of skepticism and saying that truth is something that you cannot really find. Maybe if it exists at all, it's dimly at the bottom of a well. And that position is one that Epicurus was rejecting and could be followed up with the question of to what extent Epicurus is really saying that philosophy is necessary in order to live a happy life. We've been debating a question over on the forum over the last week that gets into that question. And it does seem to me that there are many passages through Epicurus where he's taking the position that unless you spend the time to study nature, you're not going to be as happy, certainly, as you could be if you did take that time to have this understanding of things. I know that some people kind of pull back from the idea that studying philosophy is a requirement for the best life, but I'm not sure that Epicurus is not taking that position.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I do think that people are able to come at it, but in part because philosophy has informed so much of how we understand things anyway, in part because it has formed the way we are educated, right? So they studied natural science and we study that in school. So you merge with some kind of understanding about how this stuff works. And then presumably there will be many, many people who will go on to study these things even after they leave school.
To me, it's an interesting question to observe that while Epicurus is stressing the benefits of philosophy and the study of nature, in the end, the conclusion that you reach after doing that and understanding his philosophy is that it is observation itself, which is the key, and that your logical analysis is really not the key. It's almost as if he's saying that if you've got the confidence to accept your senses and the things that it's telling you, then you're going to be okay. But most people don't seem to have this confidence, or under pressure from others who say that they're wrong, they give in. So it perhaps might be more of a matter that you need philosophy to overcome the objections of these other philosophers if you're concerned about them and if you're hit with them. And I think about Frances Wright's book again with her character of Hedea in that book, who sort of seemed to stand for that proposition. She was very headstrong that she understood all these things without the necessity of a lot of book learning. And Frances Wright, through Epicurus in that book, really does not rebuke her on that. She seems to get along quite well without spending all of her time studying the books like some of the other people in that dialogue were doing.
Let me take up one issue there, Cassius, which is that in one particular area of our lives, I think we're actually worse off than the average Greek peasant farmer in the 3rd century. And that is that in the way that we have structured our society today, death is almost entirely hidden from us. All of these sort of weird and gross aspects of the process of a body dying and decaying is concealed from us, right? People don't really die, as everyone used to die, pretty much, in the home anymore. You don't have the wake in the home. That's all done by professionals elsewhere. And people often die in the hospital, right? So this, what they call this new phenomena of the so-called hidden death has, I think, set people up for a problem when they come to the end of their lives because they haven't really come face to face with this problem before. So that's an interesting question that I think is maybe something that they were doing differently and perhaps in a way that was more conducive to grappling with these questions than how we're doing it.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that's a very important point. You've got Seneca recording that Epicurus had said, meditate on death. You have apparently sort of an art form among the people at this time to have the skeleton cups and so forth, the skeleton drawings of Epicurus and other philosophers. And you just don't have today the constant companionship and experience of death of people around you. Many people live in cities. They don't even necessarily have pets or other animals to observe their deaths. And you mentioned going into a hospital and dying. And of course, if you're going into a hospital with COVID-19 over the last couple of years, you're isolated from your family. The family doesn't even see the person in their final moments or final weeks before they die. So I think that is a huge issue myself, and would suggest that as we develop ideas for teaching Epicurean philosophy or coaching people on how to appreciate Epicurus's perspective, that finding ways to get back in touch with death would be an important part of that. Because even if you don't talk about it, it clearly is one of the issues that most people wrestle with throughout their lives. And suppressing it and putting it off and not dealing with it until you're much older is a recipe for not being ready to confront it when it does occur. Okay, it looks like section 10 here is where Torquatus is going to launch off and discuss the essential point that surely no one recoils from or dislikes or avoids pleasure in itself because it's pleasure, but because great pains come upon those who do not know how to follow pleasure rationally. Nor is there anyone who loves or pursues or wishes to win pain on its own account just because it's pain, but rather because circumstances sometimes occur in which you can seek some great pleasure at the cost of exertion and pain. So one thing worth commenting on here is that Torquatus's argument is presuming that it's simply natural to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain. And the issue is not that we don't understand that, but that we make mistakes in how we do it.
He says, who again would have any right to reproach either a man who desires to be surrounded by pleasure, unaccompanied by any annoyance, or another man who shrinks from any pain which is not productive of pleasure? But in truth, we do blame and deem most deserving of righteous hatred the man who, enervated and depraved by the fascination of momentary pleasures, do not foresee the pains and troubles which are sure to befall them, because they are blinded by desire, and in the same error are involved those who prove traitors to their duties through effeminacy of spirit, I mean because they shun exertions and trouble.
You could almost single out and say that what he's saying is that the problem that most people have with pleasure is not pleasure itself, but they don't know how to follow it rationally, and they end up in big trouble. which has always struck me as interesting because I don't know that really the Stoics fit under that category. This is perhaps a little more charitable to the enemies of pleasure than I would be myself, because I think there are people who do in fact worship pain because they think there's something good about it, and who avoid pleasure because they think there's something intrinsically bad about it.
Yeah, and it's somewhat more nuanced because one of the features of early monastic Christianity was the idea that we have to in some way imitate the suffering of Christ on the cross, because our goal is not pain, but we have to go through that. We have to imitate his experience of pain, and we have to feel that really deeply in order to purify ourselves for the real purpose, which is, of course, to go to paradise. And that is when we will experience pleasure beyond any ability that the human mind has to understand. We're going to have that there, but here we have to pursue pain, because that's how we get closer to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Worth probably noting that I think the Catholic Church has gotten away from that position.
Yeah, this reminds me also of something that Emily Austin said about her book, Living for Pleasure. I think I remember her saying that she started to title it something like Doing Pleasure Right, which rings a bell with what Torquatus is saying here. The argument that you're about to hear from Torquatus here is addressed to people who want to do pleasure right. And much of his extensive argument about the virtues and how to look at them is going to be an explanation of how you can do pleasure correctly, do pleasure right. But if you don't accept that pursuing pleasure is a legitimate goal in the first place, these issues of doing it right aren't necessarily going to make any impact on you if you take the position, like you just mentioned, of the Catholic Church or any other group who thinks that there's something intrinsically good about pain and intrinsically bad about pleasure.
So I think the next thing we have here is his response to what Cicero has to say about Torquatus's ancestors, these famous Romans who had behaved so gallantly in certain instances. He says, "You a little while ago showed at once your copious memory and your friendly and kindly feeling for me by quoting the examples of my forefathers. Now I ask, what interpretation do you put upon the actions of these men? Do you believe that they attacked the armed foe or practiced such cruelty towards their own children and their own flesh and blood absolutely without giving a thought to their own interest or their own advantage? Why, even the beasts do not act so as to produce such a tumult and confusion that we cannot see the purpose of their movements and attacks. Do you believe that men so exceptional achieve such great exploits from no motive whatever? What the motive was, I shall examine presently. Meanwhile, I shall maintain this, that if they perform those actions which are beyond question noble from some motivation, their motive was not virtue apart from all else." And he goes on to say that indeed, if they had done it purely for virtue, he says, "I should be sorry to be descended from one so abominable and so cruel." But if he did those things to enforce by his self-inflicted pain the law of military command, and by fear of punishment to control the army in the midst of a most critical war, then he had in view the preservation of his fellow countrymen, which he knew to involve his own. And these principles have a wide application. There is one field in which the eloquence of your school has been wont especially to vaunt itself, and your own eloquence in particular, for you are an eager investigator of the past. I mean the stories of illustrious and heroic men, and the applause of their actions viewed as looking not to any reward, but to the inherent comeliness of morality. All such arguments, says Torquatus, are upset when once the principle of choice, which I have just described, has been established, whereby it is either pleasure which is neglected for the purpose of obtaining pleasure still greater, or you incur pain for the sake of escaping still greater pain.
Yeah, this is a section of Cicero's criticism where he's allowing Torquatus to respond at length, and I think pretty well here. I don't know that you read each of the items about why he's doing it. He stripped the foe of his necklet, and he did it to save his own life. But he faced a grave danger, yes, with the whole army looking on, which gets applause and affection, which are the strongest guarantees for passing life and freedom from fear. So Torquatus is definitely responding directly to what Cicero said and saying that it's not the immediate bodily pleasure of fighting your enemy or punishing your son or doing these other things that are so difficult. It is the eventual pleasure that you get from the subsequent results of what you've done that factor into the equation and produce an overall positive balance of pleasure over pain for what you've done. And that really does get back into this issue. It'll come up a little bit later in the dialogue about mental pleasure versus bodily pleasure. None of these things that the Torquati did would have been particularly pleasurable to them bodily, directly and immediately by any means, but they led to consequences, both bodily and mental, over time and in seriousness, which outweighed the exertions that were required when they were doing those actions. And that really is, as Torquatus is saying here, of huge significance, because all these arguments against pleasure are upset when the principle is accepted that you incur pains for the sake of escaping still greater pains. It's a way of looking at the full picture of all the results of what you do that brings everything into focus rather than simply looking at the momentary physical sensations that are involved.
Right. Now, one of the things that's going to become very important in this dialogue is this question as to whether there are three states, pleasure, pain, and a neutral state in which you neither feel pleasure nor pain, or whether there are only the two states. And he says, Epicurus refused to allow that there is any middle term between pain and pleasure. What was thought by some to be a middle term, the absence of all pain, was not only itself pleasure, but the highest pleasure possible. Surely anyone who is conscious of his own condition must needs be either in a state of pleasure or in a state of pain. The feelings are two, as Epicurus says. So this becomes a crucial part of the understanding of pleasure in this whole dialogue. He goes on to say, Epicurus thinks that the highest degree of pleasure is defined by the removal of all pain, so that pleasure may afterwards exhibit diversities and differences, but is incapable of increase or extension. And now, Cassius, your favorite, your favorite section.
Yes, the hand argument with Chrysippus. But I tell you what, I don't know how successful we're being in going quickly through Torquatus here, but what you've just read is so very, very important because so many questions are answered here when you look at exactly what Torquatus is saying. For the pleasure which we pursue is not that alone which excites the natural constitution by a kind of sweetness, and of which sensual enjoyment is attended. I wish he'd finished the sentence in a little bit different way, because when you say you're not alone looking for this stimulation, you should say you're also looking for these other pleasures that we're describing as mental or just different types. You're not looking for constant euphoria of being on a roller coaster. There's all sorts of other pleasures in life, including the ones that Cicero's told Torquatus not to talk about, which are things like poetry and literature and history.
Right. And Lucretius is almost equally frustrating on this point, isn't he, Cassius? Because one of the questions that came up in DeWitt's book was this question of what DeWitt called the summum bonum fallacy, and whether pleasure should properly be understood as the telos, or the goal or the end of life, or it should be understood as the greatest good, the summum bonum. And Lucretius has instances in which he refers to pleasure as dux vitae, the guide of life. So pleasure is the guide. And yet in the proem to Book 6, he refers without naming pleasure to the summum bonum in those terms. So that Epicurus had revealed to us what the summum bonum was, but then he doesn't say what it was. So sometimes you wish these people would finish their thoughts. It would be a lot easier for us.
Well, in Cicero's case, we can potentially blame him for intentionally not presenting it in the most clear and complete fashion. But I tell you what, when you look at some of these sentences here, I think it's an extremely important sentence that's right here around line 38 that you've already read, Joshua. It's not in Principal Doctrine number 3 directly, but it's implied in it. This quote, surely anyone who is conscious of his own condition must necessarily be either in a state of pleasure or a state of pain. So I think if you take that sentence and really think about it, I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion than Epicurus is labeling every experience, everything you're conscious of in life as either pleasurable or painful. And if it's not painful, it's pleasurable. And if it's not pleasurable, it's painful. And of course, in the very next sentence where he talks about the highest degree of pleasure is defined by the removal of all pain, so that pleasure may afterwards exhibit diversities and differences, but is incapable of increase or extension. We've been discussing that even as recently as today. I believe it's principle doctrine number 9, or at least the ones that discuss about condensing pleasure and whether pleasures are different from each other or the same and how you compare them to each other and so forth. There's no doubt when a sentence like this occurs that Torquatus is saying that Epicurus held that pleasure certainly exhibits diversities and differences. So it would be pretty perverse to ignore the words diversities and differences in discussing pleasure and to simply say that the height of pleasure is when pain is absent without acknowledging that there will be differences and divergences of the type pleasures that are being experienced at that point. Is the height of pleasure the same for everyone? If so, to what extent is it the same for everyone? If not, how does it differ? In fact, we were discussing Epicurus's last week and the condition he was in at that particular time. And the person made a comment that raised the question of whether Epicurus himself was in ataraxia during the last week of his life. And of course, some people will say that ataraxia is sort of a label that means the same thing for every person. To what extent does it mean the same thing? And to what extent does it not mean the same thing for every person? Is the ataraxia of Joshua the same as the ataraxia for Calasini?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that in modern psychology that we'll talk about different people as being susceptible to different levels of affect, what they call it. And so some people will feel things, I think, more deeply. In fact, Epicurus says himself that the philosopher will feel emotion more deeply than other people. But that's emotion, and you're asking about pleasure. So I don't know. Do you have an answer to that question?
I think it must differ between people, and that ataraxia is really referring, in my view, like aponia, absence of disturbance or absence of pain, while you are doing something else in terms of experiencing other pleasures, whether it's a roller coaster or whether it's reading poetry. No matter what the other pleasure is, it's not the precise pleasure that's being discussed with ataraxia or aponia, but the fact that whatever pleasures there are in your experience, you're not having to mix those pleasures with any degree of disturbance or any degree of pain. That would be my current view of how best to explain that. But again, my opinion means nothing. It's best to try to fit things together with what Epicurus and here Torquatus is saying. And that takes us to the Chrysippus hand argument, where Torquatus says there was the statue of Chrysippus holding out his hands, with the implication that when you ask the question, does your hand being in its present condition feel the lack of anything at all? Certainly of nothing. But if pleasure were the supreme good, it would feel a lack. I agree. Pleasure then is not the supreme good. That's the argument that Chrysippus is making. That in your natural condition of your hand, if your hand is not feeling any kind of outside stimulus, if it isn't being massaged, if it isn't feeling some touch that's particularly pleasurable to it, if it's not doing anything special, Chrysippus is arguing, your hand is not experiencing pleasure, and therefore it must feel a lack of pleasure. And if it doesn't feel a lack of pleasure in its normal condition, then why in the world would you say pleasure is your supreme good? And Torquatus explains that by saying, my father used to say even a statue would not talk in that way if it had the power of speech. The argument is shrewd enough against the Cyrenaics, but does not touch Epicurus. The Cyrenaics presumably here being referred to because they were into the stimulation of bodily pleasures and not so much in terms of other types of pleasures. Torquatus says, for if the only pleasure were that which, as it were, tickles the senses, if I may say so, and attended by sweetness, overflows and insinuates itself into them, neither the hand nor any other member would be able to rest satisfied with the absence of pain, apart from this joyous activity of pleasure. But if it's the highest pleasure, as Epicurus believes, to be in no pain, then the first admission that the hand in its then existing condition felt no lack was okay, but the second admission was improper in that you would not admit that it felt a lack of pleasure because, quote, it would certainly feel no lack, and on this ground, for this reason, that anything which is cut off from the state of pain is in the state of pleasure. So now, again, regardless of whether we're talking about supreme goods or guides or goals or ataraxia or aponia or anything else that you want to throw out there, Torquatus is explaining that Epicurus's position was that if you're not feeling pain, you're in a state of pleasure. So the hand which is not feeling a pinprick or not feeling too hot or not feeling too cold, the hand which is otherwise doing nothing other than in its normal state is feeling pleasure, with the implication that you're going to apply that analogy from the hand to the full human being and the full human life. If you're not in some specific pain from a specific source, what you're doing is you're experiencing pleasure. And when you've removed all these pinpricks and all these pains, mental and bodily, from your life, then what you're feeling, no matter what you're doing, no matter whether you're on a roller coaster or you're lying reading Lucretius poetry, no matter what you're doing in your life, if you're not in some specific mental or bodily pain, you are experiencing pleasure. That would seem to me to be the import of Torquatus's argument about Chrysippus here.
I'm wondering now, did Chrysippus have Epicureanism in mind? The reason I mention that is because if you refer back to Don's article and video on the location of the garden in or near ancient Athens, it is sort of adjacent to an area called the Ceramicus, which is a district of ancient Athens, part of which was inside the walls of the city, northwest of the Acropolis, and part of which was sort of spilling out over the walls near where the Dipylon Gate was on the Academy Road. And so I don't know if you put this statue there because Epicureans are going to see this on their walk to the garden, or if they put it there because the Ceramicus was also the site of an important cemetery, and you had other funerary sculptures that were erected along this road. So I'm not clear on that, whether he had the Epicureans directly in mind and positioned the statue there because of its proximity to the school. But certainly Chrysippus would have thought that this was an argument to be used against anyone who said that pleasure was the good. But Torquatus has given us, I think, a very good counterargument.
Yeah, Joshua, it looks like Diogenes Laertius, at least under section 4 of his biography of Epicurus, Laertius says Chrysippus tried to rival Epicurus in the amount of his writings, as Carnedius tells us, calling him a parasite who fed on Epicurus's books. Whenever Epicurus wrote anything, Chrysippus felt bound in rivalry to write the equivalent. And this is why he often repeats himself and says whatever occurs to him. Chrysippus, quote, felt bound in rivalry to Epicurus. So whether, again, the statue got erected for that particular purpose, I'm not sure, but certainly could have been, and would make sense that the people who erected it and people who talked about it, just like Torquatus here, understood it to be.
Right, and of course, Cicero, knew where the location of the garden was near the Ceramicus in ancient Athens because he describes a walk with his friend Titus Pomponius Atticus along the Academy Road from the Dipylon Gate, in which they had, quote, just passed by the Garden of Epicurus.
You know, sometimes as I read this, I wonder if the indictment of Cicero for misrepresenting Epicurus is as much an indictment of Cicero as it is an indictment of my own lack of understanding or of different commentators in the many years since then, because he is presenting here in this exchange the key response to Cicero's arguments, to all these arguments. He's explaining, it may not be as clear as we would like, and that may be the problem, but he's explaining that Epicurus's position was, if you're not in pain, you're in pleasure. And so it's pretty easy to take that as a foundation and logically apply that to realize that no matter what you're doing, if you're not in pain, you're in pleasure. And no matter what you're doing, if you have totally eliminated all pains from your life, then no matter what you're doing, you're at the height of pleasure because you can't experience anything more than full and complete pleasure. So it seems to me that the elements of the argument are included here. Now, maybe we don't understand it and maybe we don't think it makes sense. And maybe we're following Cicero and thinking that this is kind of an impractical and doctrinaire and abstract approach to things. But in the end, it comes down to, do we accept the position that life in the absence of pain is pleasure? Or do we take the position Cicero's trying to argue that pleasure means, as we often say, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and nothing else that's not so stimulating? If you take the wider position of pleasure, then a lot of this seems to fall into place much more easily than it would otherwise. You don't go off looking for some new experience that nobody can even describe. You simply realize that your experiences of life, no matter what you're doing, are pleasurable unless you're specifically in pain.
Right. The next section is section 12 here in Roman numerals at about line 40. And what we get now is kind of an understanding of what Cicero has in mind when he thinks of the Epicurean life of pleasures. Torquatus says, again, the truth that pleasure is the supreme good can be most easily apprehended from the following consideration. Let us imagine an individual in the enjoyment of pleasures great, numerous, and constant, both mental and bodily, with no pain to thwart or threaten them. I ask, what circumstances can we describe as being more excellent or more desirable than these? A man whose circumstances are such must needs possess, as well as other things, a robust mind, subject to no fear of death or pain, because death is apart from sensation, and pain when lasting is usually slight, when oppressive is of short duration, so that its temporariness reconciles us to its intensity, and its slightness to its continuance. When, in addition, we suppose that such a man is in no awe of the influence of the gods, and does not allow his past pleasures to slip away, but takes delight in constantly recalling them, what circumstance is it possible to add to these to make his condition better? And then he gives us the contrary point of view of the most miserable person. I think Cicero is quite interesting on this when he, I think, rather fairly gives an explanation of what the blessed life for an Epicurean looks like. And I think it is something that you would have to concede is appealing.
Yeah, Joshua, I see this as an elaboration and almost a commentary on what Epicurus is saying himself in the letter to Menorchius. In more specific terms, I don't think there's anywhere in Epicurean literature a better summary of what the core components of an Epicurean life would be from this Epicurean perspective. And so this list of characteristics, I think, is just one of the absolute best that anybody could go to try to get a handle on what Epicurus is suggesting as the best way to live. But let me ask this question about what you've just read. What kind of an argument is this? He's saying that this can be easily apprehended from the following consideration. It's not necessarily a hypothetical, but he's saying, let us imagine these things. He's saying, let us visualize these things.
It's a kind of thought experiment, I suppose, where you put yourself into a situation mentally and think how you would respond or react if you were living under these conditions, I guess.
To what is it appealing? In the beginning, he says, look at nature, look at what the young of all species do, and you'll see that they pursue pleasure and avoid pain. This seems to be a little bit of a separate argument. He's no longer saying, look at nature. He's seeming to say, think about it. And then when you do think about it, something's going to give you the answer. Is this an anticipation? Is this a prolepsis argument? Is it itself a pleasure and pain argument to some extent? But it's not anymore. It's just saying simply, look at that animal over there. He's pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. He's saying somehow, if you think about this, you will then realize. What is it that causes you to realize the truth of the argument when you go through this?
Yeah, it's true that he doesn't really mention this foundation in Epicureanism of pleasure on the observation of animals. And of course, people are going to disagree and say things like a man who is not in awe of the gods is not happy, is not living a life of pleasure. So there's going to be disagreements there. But I think probably it's built on that same foundation. But you raise an interesting question, Cassius, because he doesn't point to that. He seems to be saying that you can, like a Platonist, sit in your cave or in your ivory tower and just think this into reality and it will be true. You don't need a sensory observation to build it on.
Well, I'm saying that if you think about it, you're going to, for some reason, immediately agree with it. There's going to be something within you that tells you that what you've just visualized is something that you want for yourself and that you can't think of anything better. And in regard to the pain section, you're going to immediately realize that this is the worst thing you could experience and you don't want any part of it. There's something within you that's telling you when you visualize this to accept it. And I'm not suggesting I necessarily have an answer to that question, but it strikes me that it is a different argument than just saying, look over there at those pigs. He's saying, if you think about this, there's something within you that will compel you to this conclusion that this makes sense.
What he's inviting you to do really is to reflect on your own experience of pleasure and pain. So I do experience pain throughout my day. And he's saying, well, think of that, but then think of this, a life completely free from pain, completely free from fear. So he's really leveraging your own experience of pain and your own experience of pleasure, even regardless of whether you agree that those are the goal or the end of life. He's leveraging those into getting you to accept his idea of the good life.
Yeah, this is an interesting sentence that I think you read. Nor indeed can our mind find any other ground whereon to take its stand, as though already at the goal. So there's something there about the way the mind works that he says that this just is going to click with you when you think about it.
Right. And the part we didn't read is the other part of that, in which he says, imagine, on the other hand, a man worn by the greatest mental and bodily pains which can befall a human being, with no hope before him that his lot will ever be lighter, destitute of pleasure, a pitiable object, a life replete with pains. So that's part of the equation as well, is he's saying, well, if you don't want this life, here's the alternative, and it's a horror show.
Okay, well, that's some deep material there. As we turn to section 13 of the book, Torquatus is going to launch off into a long discussion of virtue and how virtue for its own sake makes no sense as being the goal of life. But we're going to reserve that, I think, until the next episode of our series here. Let's go around and get any additional thoughts or closing comments for today. Martin?
I have nothing to add.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Calasini, any thoughts today?
Yes, there was the topic, philosophy is necessary to live a happy life. And that, to me, is an interesting thing to contemplate, because it's really talking about that you need to think about what brings happiness, and you need to discuss it and contemplate it. At least that's how I interpret it. And then within Epicureanism, it seems we have the contrast with previous schools of philosophy, which say, in a sense, they are worshiping an abstract virtue, and they are not clear about the purpose of, or they do not see virtue as a tool in the way that Epicureans see virtue and the practical application of virtue as that which brings a pleasurable life. So basically, it's important to see the contrast. In a way, it's almost subtle, but yet I think the emphasis really comes down to practical application of virtue, that you're not going to worship beauty, but actually beauty is something to enjoy.
Yeah, I think I can comfortably rant for a little bit about this idea that I kind of sidestepped earlier. And it's this question as to whether you have to study philosophy in order to be happy. And the reason I think that I'm so resistant to this is because I have, and I'm sure that everyone here has been, on the receiving end of the same kind of treatment, but from a different source. And you'll see it on bumper stickers, right, where it says, if you know Jesus, then you will know peace. But if there is no Jesus in your life, then you won't have any peace. That it's impossible to be happy, that it's impossible to be fulfilled, that it's impossible to be undisturbed by fear if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, right? So this is the claim that I've heard my entire life, and it's something that has really led me to this position where I don't like to comment on someone else's experience, right, in a way that would say, well, you say that you're experiencing happiness, you say that you're experiencing pleasure, you say that you're experiencing these things, but I know you're not because you don't have the key ingredient. And the key ingredient is, whether it's Jesus or whether it's Epicurus or whether it's virtue or any of these other things, I fundamentally think people can work their way to some of these conclusions without having to spend their whole lives studying philosophy. I do it because I really, really enjoy doing it. But to say to other people that you think you're happy, but if only you had the knowledge and the education and the experience of study that I have, then you would know that you're miserable. It's sort of like when people tell me that, Josh, that God exists because his laws are written on your heart, and there are none that will not bow on Judgment Day. and you know deep down that he's real. And the only reason you don't follow him, you don't accept him, is because you want to sin. And there's a term in psychology for this. This is called gaslighting, and I'm just really, really uncomfortable with it. So that's kind of my response to it. I don't mean to sound like I have this much venom for it, but to be on the receiving end of this is, in my experience, unpleasant, because it's kind of like, I don't know, a bit of a Kafka trap, I guess, where even your denial that, oh no, I really think I am happy. I really think I am in pleasure. Oh, well, that's just the devil trying to convince you, or whatever ridiculous thing they might say. Anyway, that's my response to that issue. Does anyone else have anything maybe more constructive to say?
I have a question, Joshua. So are you saying that your comprehension or your understanding of the word philosophy is a given belief in a sense, so that it's more an object or a subject of something rather than an action that is done? Because let me just finish saying what I mean to say is that I think I'm coming from philosophy is a verb, something that you do. So it's the act of examining things and the act of contemplating things. So maybe we're talking about two different things here.
Yeah, I guess I think I use it in both senses, though, as a kind of discipline that has an architecture with branches of study that you can explore, but it's meaningless unless you actually explore those things. It's meaningless unless you actually do have the kind of inquiry that Torquatus and Cicero and Triarius are supposedly having in this dialogue, that if you don't do it, then it really is just like a bookshelf with books you don't read. But even then, I just don't think that happiness requires that. Here's the problem, I guess, is that there are some people, and I think I am one of them, who, even if we wanted to, we could not stop asking questions about the nature of the world we live in. We can't stop asking questions about what happens when we die, and we can't stop asking questions about the way that other people have framed their understanding of nature, especially if they're trying to push that understanding on us. And the problem is, like I say, it's not even voluntary. My brain just chews on this stuff. And so that's probably more than any other reason why I study philosophy. And the fact that I get a lot of pleasure and a lot of enjoyment out of it is very valuable to me. But I don't feel like someone coming to me and saying, well, you're never really going to be happy unless you study stoicism and practice virtue. You're never going to be happy. You're never going to live the good life unless you study what Plato has to say about the false image, the false front that nature presents to you, and you dig deeper and find your way to the ideal forms. You're never going to be happy unless you do those things. So it's something that I don't like being said to me, and I don't like saying it to other people. I think it's a bit presumptuous.
Okay, thank you. So I think I understand a little bit more clearly. And I just want to say that I'm going to need to do some more research regarding what philosophy could mean, because you're framing it a certain way. And how is it that I have such a different viewpoint on that? I will do some research and post into the podcast thread, because I still come back to this idea of there's some kind of action going on. It's a verb. It's not so much what you're believing, but that it's something that you're actively doing.
I'm glad we decided to stop where we did, because that did lead to some interesting discussion. I'll close us by going back to what we said earlier about Francis Wright. I have a feeling that the same issue perhaps might explain to some extent this character of Hadia in A Few Days in Athens, who I've always thought was otherwise kind of mysterious to me as to why she would write this character into the book the way that she did. But Hadia's distinguishing characteristic, it seems to me, in A Few Days in Athens, is that she is dismissive of the need to go into extensive philosophical discussions. She's very aware of the issues, it seems like, and has a firm, confident understanding of the right answer to these questions. And so she's criticizing these other schools that she's visited herself. But she's very strong in the position that it's not necessary to immerse yourself in books all the time in order to have a happy life, which may be, like I said, coming from the position that Joshua Calasini's talking about. So that's something to think about. But I would say Epicurus' concern about the need for philosophy, it's not going to arise in every case, because people who somehow grow up without these corrupting influences before they've been perverted by these errors, as Torquatus is saying here, looking at the young of all species, if you somehow are able to escape like a puppy or a kitten or whatever and grow up without being perverted by incorrect philosophy, then you won't need to spend as much time in the books and studying these issues as you would otherwise. But because of our friend Cicero and because of all these people who spend so much time laboring to convince us to pursue these ideas that Epicurus has concluded are wrong, most people, it seems, by the time they become an adult, have been in many ways thoroughly corrupted with bad ideas about what happiness is all about, what pleasure is all about, what life is all about. And if you've gotten to that stage, crippled in a way by these incorrect ideas, you're not going to be able to get rid of them unless you do study philosophy. The very first words of the letter to Menorchius, let no one when young delay to study philosophy, nor when he is old grow weary of his study. For no one can come too early or too late to secure the health of his soul. So it clearly is an emphasis of Epicurus, not just because he needs to have a school and make money and make a living, but because he thinks it's a really good idea that you study nature and study philosophy and thereby get the kind of confidence that allows you to live your life as happily as you possibly can. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and close for the day. Please drop by the forum and let us know if you have any comments or questions. Thanks for your time today. We'll be back in a week.